Thank you, Judith, and thank you for listening to all of us as one of our keynote listeners. Right now, we're going to have a chance to be part of a conversation, and it's a conversation that's timely not only for this week when the UN General Assembly convenes, but that's timely for our time as people around the world convene on issues that matter to them, and as we talk about who is and how we can be part of and how do we support civil society. We're about to be part of a conversation between Pete Cashmore of Mashable, our partner and friend, and Samantha Power, permanent representative to the United Nations of the United States of America. Ambassador Power is the U.S. permanent representative and a member of President Obama's cabinet, and at the UN, she works to advance U.S. interests to promote and defend universal values and address pressing global challenges to global peace, security, and prosperity. We're grateful to her for helping weave together this strong relationship between the U.S. and the United Nations. Prior to serving in this role, Ambassador Power served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights on the National Security Staff at the White House. In that role, she focused on issues including UN reform, LGBT and women's rights, the promotion of religious freedom and the protection of religious minorities, human trafficking, and democracy and human rights. But for those of you who have read, studied, and been inspired by Ambassador Power, you know that that's not her portfolio from the White House. That's been the part of her life from the very start. Help me and help welcome a conversation between Pete Cashmore and during a week in which we know this is an important dialogue and when her time is very valuable, Ambassador Samantha Power.
Thanks so much. Hey, thank you. Thanks so much. Well, thank you, Ambassador, for joining us at a conference that's already getting a lot of momentum online. We're excited to have you here, especially because the Social Good Summit is very much about a lot of what your work is about, which is about how do you empower people, especially through technology. And your career has really been about the importance of human rights, human dignity. Maybe you could start by talking a little bit about how your career got you here and why those things matter so much.
Okay. I'm starting to feel self-conscious that I didn't polish my shoes.
Well, you didn't. What you guys missed, though, is backstage, I almost covered the ambassador in coffee.
Yeah.
And we were just quickly, little domestic emergency backstage.
Indeed.
We're good, though.
Indeed, we're good.
But I do have a little coffee still.
Okay.
We're all human.
True. So, in terms of my own journey, I would not ever have been picked in high school to be most likely to become a human rights advocate or somebody who so believed in the power of ordinary citizens to change the world. But I was very moved when I was in college when I saw for the first time the footage from Tiananmen Square and I was working as an intern in the sports department of the CBS affiliate in Atlanta, and I was taking notes on a Braves game, and then I looked up, and there was Tiananmen, like with the crushing of this democratic movement and moment. And so that kind of got into my head that, wow, look what those citizens, what they're trying to do for their country, for their children, for their grandchildren. And then when I graduated from college, I was struck by images in the New York Times of emaciated men behind barbed wire again in Europe 50 years after the Holocaust. And it was at a time when the Bosnian Serbs were cracking down brutally, committing ethnic cleansing, a term that was sort of invented in that conflict. And I just thought, wow, there's got to be something that we can do about this. I will say often, when we talk about technology, which I'm sure we'll get to in the pros and cons, I often say when I used to teach young people, students, I would say, the one downside of the technology is the way we select around our pre-existing preferences. And I would never, in 1992, graduating from college, have put into my search engine concentration camps. But I stumbled into it by virtue of the sort of fuller exposure that one got through opening the New York Times the old-fashioned way. Now my students say, ooh, the smudge, it's so terrible. And I say, but it's serendipity and the kind of things, the ways you can get moved.
But do you think people are finding out about these things more in this new world of technology? Are they more informed or are they less informed?
Well, I think as the technology evolves, it feels like, and I know people are alert to this risk, that we just become more insulated and more cocooned in our own, more pleasant preferences, right? But I think alert to that, more and more people are trying to seek out kind of connections, and we all know how it works on the internet. You start here and then you end up over here. But I guess what I'm getting at in particular are kind of inconvenient topics, things that one wouldn't voluntarily really seek out because they're depressing, or one feels disempowered by even the magnitude of the badness. And I think a lot of us have that emotion. I mean, even in the job I have now, you sometimes think, oh, Syria being the latest example of that is just so heartbreaking, and you could imagine why young people might not want to spend a lot of time watching videos of kids who've been gassed by chemical weapons, right? I mean, that's not necessarily what one seeks out. So I think it's just, be alert to once people are hooked and they have the conviction and they have the compassion and they want to make a difference and they want to activate, raise money, or alert people to human rights abuses or influence their congressman or whatever, then technology is dreamy, right? Because it is a force multiplier like nothing we've seen.
I mean, fundamentally, you kind of hinted at that question, and we can get into specifics soon. But with regards to technology, is it fundamentally a tool of democracy and of civil society and of these values you're trying to push? Is it fundamentally, as we often discuss on the stage, is it just a very neutral thing, and it depends how you use it? I mean, what's your take on that?
We've got examples on both sides of the ledger. I mean, governments are growing more and more sophisticated at shutting down the internet, blocking, filtering, using technology to trace human rights activists. The famous incident in Syria, devastating incident, where Marie Colvin, who was one of the greatest journalists of all time, greatest war correspondent, one of the greatest war correspondents of the last century, was, we think, tracked down by virtue of her cell phone, the coordinates on her cell phone, and then struck by the Assad regime and taken, killed. And so we have those examples on the other hand. And then I just came from a meeting just now. There are a lot of civil society activists who are in town, and I met with a subset of them just before coming on stage. Many of them are going to be meeting with President Obama tomorrow, who is himself very concerned about the crackdown on civil society that's going on around the world, the use of technologies to impede rather than expand democratic accountability and civic activism. It's a major problem right now, a major. I just want to make sure everybody's alert to this trend around the world, even with all the technology. But this young Syrian activist was describing in Syria, Assad has used Scud missiles and fired Scud missiles on his own people, which again is just ghastly. But it takes apparently between 8 to 15 minutes for these missiles to land from the time of launch. And they now have people who are texting, if they see anything in the launch phase, texting the coordinates from where the launch occurred, I guess, and somehow able to predict then sort of the flight trajectory. And that text message goes to some central hub, and then people in the area where the Scud is likely to land X number of minutes hence will receive a text message warning them of that. Now, it's obviously not sufficient when you think about what a Scud can do, but it's an example of the creativity and the ways in which people are using this technology. I traveled with the president a couple years ago to India, and there's this amazing website in India called IPaidAbribe.com. And it's basically just people sharing their personal testimonials about how just the indignity of having paid a bribe. And then there is a second section, or was the last time I checked, on the site that was, I didn't pay a bribe. So they actually list sort of the ways in which they stood up to a particular person who was trying to get a bribe in order to get social services or to get their kid into school or this or that. And then there's a third section to the site that's, I didn't have to pay a bribe. And it's about like the kind of noble civil servants who are just doing their jobs, in cultures that often make bribery the exception and bribery the rule and not the exception. So, again, the ways of sort of heroizing one form of behavior, creating a community of concern, to activate the Sentinel, the satellite Sentinel project that George Clooney, John Prendergast, and others have used. paying for or getting companies to donate satellite time and resources so they can document mass graves in parts of the world that are not necessarily accessible to humanitarian workers. So it feels like it's the yin and the yang. It's a lot. It feels like how you use it.
I mean, we're seeing a lot of these issues in the news, even this week. It's very much a hot button issue. To what extent is government responsible for these situations? To what extent can individuals help? If you're someone here in America or globally that wants to engage in these issues, that believes in the power of democracy, I mean, what is the role of the civilian, and then what is the role of government?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on the situation, but certainly citizens have the capacity, as they did in this country on Darfur, to put an issue on the map. And that was driven mainly by young people and people in the faith community, Jewish groups, Christian groups, and others teaming up with high school students, college students, and they made Darfur matter in Washington. I think there's fundraising that is done via using these technological tools. Once people do get moved by what they see or are exposed to, it's a great way of pooling resources and really getting it to people in need. We've created in the U.S. government, or combined, I should say, partnered with civil society organizations, foundations, and I think other governments to create a lifeline fund for those human rights defenders who are being arrested or being targeted by their governments, so that they feel like someone in the international community has their back. So it's voice, it's resources, it's political pressure, on people like me, because everybody has bandwidth issues. So what issue is on the map on at a particular time at a particular level of government is variable. And we were talking just a minute ago about Twitter, which I've just joined. I'm completely unsophisticated.
What's your handle?
What is my handle? I think # Ambassador Power. Insomeone tell me. I think it's Ambassador Power. Ambassador Power. Okay, Ambassador Power. I should tell everybody. Initially I was following only one person, my husband, and. That's # Cass Sunstein, or hashtag Cass Sunstein. Very, very, very interesting, also worth following. But maybe not worth being the only person I follow. So it has taken me time and then I would get these notes from people saying, well, you don't care about our issues? I'll be like, no, I care passionately about your issues. I just didn't know about following. So I'm learning myself how to make use of these tools in a rather primitive way at present, but I'm seeing already the power of it. Because I'll give you a couple examples. There are issues that we are raising every day. I'm raising the plight of, for instance, a Cuban activist, Osvaldo Paya, who was run off the road in Cuba, and there hasn't been a sufficient investigation into his death, and his family has been pushing us as a government, and we've been pushing the Cubans. I encountered the Cuban foreign minister in my first week here at a UN event, raised the case, and then could come out and tweet that I had raised the case, and it could be a show of solidarity with, or at least it was an attempt at a show of solidarity with Cubans who had been pushing for human rights and democracy and pushing for an investigation into this remarkable man's death. In the old days, you'd kind of almost have to stage a press conference to be able to get your voice out there in that way, even as the UN ambassador. So the transaction cost now for speaking out on human rights issues, the bar is lower, which allows us, I think, to project American values and the priorities of this president, in a more fluid way.
Is that an example of social media becoming the primary kind of communication route for breaking news? You increasingly breaking news and decisions on social media? How does that happen?
Yeah, I think that, because you can do it so quickly, it's very easy to do it that way. But I think all forms of media still do remain relevant. Social media has its limits. Sometimes doing things so quickly is not always the way to get out the kind of nuances of a policy, which is challenging anyway on issues that are complicated, like some of those we work on. So I think you still always want to have the time to sort of expand and expound, but it might be a way of alerting people to there is a political prisoner, where all of you could make a difference in putting pressure on a particular government that has an embassy here or a mission here, or You could connect with people in European countries or in African countries and have them raise. There are ways to build coalitions, I think particularly around the fate of civil society and the prospects for human rights that just didn't exist when we were relying solely on mainstream media.
So you've been meeting with a group of activists and you have this meeting tomorrow. I mean, how are they using technology and which countries specifically do they come from and how are they engaging with technology in order to get their voices heard?
Well, again, the technology I think is a major piece. It's how they connect with one another. One of the very sad features of this crackdown on civil society that the president is seeking to draw attention to tomorrow is the ways in which leaders are learning from one another, whether it's on shutting down the internet or blocking Twitter or blocking Facebook, or every bit as egregiously just using plain old-fashioned laws and regulations to restrict foreign funding to NGOs, or to inhibit the space that they have to restrict public protest, to crack down on freedom of association. So it's not, technology is not the only problem, and it's not the only solution. This strangulation by regulation is the way a Zimbabwean colleague just put it in the meeting that we just had. So I think we're trying to signal that this is a crackdown. The governments it used to be that we would talk in development or in human rights about best practices, about how can we push for best practices. This is a sort of old-fashioned phrase. It's now clear that a lot of these governments are sharing worst practices. I mean, it's literally like textbooks on how to crack down on civil society, on how to use the tools of technology to impede social media or to impede the kind of connectivity that can occur virtually, even as they close off the public space and sort of the downtown square with their restrictive permit laws or whatever. Then they are migrating those practices that they've used over time to the internet and to the social media space. And so what technology enables these young people to do, we met with activists from Egypt, Zimbabwe, Russia, Ukraine. The president met with a bunch of Russian civil society activists when he was on his trip recently in St. Petersburg. We have a chance to show solidarity, to hear their concerns. We then can take those concerns and inject them into our bilateral diplomacy. We had heard from Sri Lankans about the importance of the Human Rights Council, which has become a venue where civil society actually gets to speak to government through something called the Universal Periodic Review. That had never existed before. So we're always seeking ways, using the perks of government to make space for civil society, both, again, pressing governments to open that space themselves, but also bringing civil society to the table. Just last point on that, the president a couple years ago created something called the Open Government Partnership, which is one of the rare multilateral initiatives that has at the table governments and civil society representatives as equals. And at the beginning, it was awkward because you'd have these people in Birkenstocks and kind of different forms of dress, literally going toe to toe in discussions in steering committee meetings about what the rules of governance should be for this multilateral partnership. And there was some discomfort. And then at a certain point, the steering committee governments started to see the benefit of this because they were actually hearing the precise ways in which we in the United States, because we had our civil society partners who were part of this. And it's the kind of input you need to tailor your policies to actually respond to the needs of real people. So not all governments are, kind of welcome that feedback, and obviously democratic governments do more than others.
To what extent does the listening role play a role in the decision-making process? Clearly, there's some very big decisions happening right now that people feel extremely strongly about, and if you follow any of your social media feeds, there's a lot of talk right now about some of the decisions that are being made. To what extent does the listening role play in? To what extent, how is the government able to listen at scale?
It's interesting. I mean, we do things like hangouts and try to, even when activists can't come to us, we try to make ourselves available to them from far away.
Right.
But, I think listening in its own right is, of course, valuable in the sense that it does show an America that cares and doesn't just care about human rights in the abstract, but cares about particular individuals and their stories. I'm a bigger fan of listening and then doing something. So that's maybe important to point out that I think, part of the function of these sessions is to actually get a more granular sense of what these people are going through. It's one thing to hear about a crackdown on civil society. It's another thing to hear so-and-so was arrested. Can your embassy go and raise his case at the highest levels?
Right. What can individuals do, though, beyond just government? What can people who are in the audience, who are at home, where, obviously tens of thousands of people are hearing these messages, to what extent can individuals get involved? What are the actions they can take?
Well, I mean, everyone knows their own sort of skill set and their own set of particular interests, for themselves. But I think we've seen activists, when an emergency strikes. We saw in Haiti famously the crowdsourcing that went on, where you literally were able to document who was buried where by virtue of people who were using this Ushahidi technology and so forth. We've seen technology being used in this country, in the United States, but also recently in the Kenya elections to police fraud. And when polling stations closed early, that was blasted around when, illegitimately closed early, perhaps to cook results. That was immediately, put onto the web, and then you'd see a kind of, all of the dissent and critiques that would flow from that. I do think, also just this point about resources, about actually knowing who's in need, whether abroad or in our own communities. Again, having that kind of transparency into that. Technology, I think, has created the possibility of a kind of Match.com. What are the things you care most about, and then are there people out there who are doing the kind of work that you would most wish you were doing if you weren't in your day job, that you'd most like to support? I think those things are very important. And then, as I said, I mean, I take very seriously now that I'm on Twitter. I take very seriously if I give a speech and people are telling me, that didn't make sense when you said that, and how does that square with this, and aren't you forgetting about these people? Why do you only talk about them and not? I mean, that's real feedback for government. And I know Secretary Kerry and Ambassador Rice, this is just on the national security side, that they also are alert to this feedback, and it gets gathered for us every night if we're running around. If I'm in the Security Council all day and haven't been able to see what people are saying, I get something in my book when I go home every night that sort of says, here's what people think of what you're up to today. Sometimes it's not.
So you got a tweet summarizer.
Yeah, maybe, but it's not always the most pleasant reading, I'll have you know. But it's important to hear, and I don't think that leaders, before this citizen voice was able to be shared so immediately, I'm not sure. I think the bubble was more pronounced. There was a layer that was very hard to penetrate.
Well, I know we're a little short on time, but I'd love to ask you finally. We're talking about 2030 now. What is the outlook for civil society, for democracy in 2030? Is it a situation where more people are empowered, where more voices are heard? Is it a situation where crackdowns continue to happen and the internet gets cut off and having a voice heard is just as difficult? I mean, what is your outlook for 2030 in civil society?
Well, I think right now the trend lines are not positive, but I think the truth of the matter is one reason that these governments are having to grow more sophisticated. In the last 5 years, 40 laws, restrictive NGO laws, have been put in place, more than 40, even in countries that are democratic, restricting freedom of speech, expression, religion, association. I mean, basic stuff. So as I said, they're sharing worst practices, but they're doing so also because they're aware of the explosion in civil society, and they're aware of the power of social media. So I think the answer to your question turns on, who's more sophisticated, who's more creative, who's better able to network, the bad guys, as it were, or the citizens who are simply trying to, enhance dignity and rights for their people. And I'd always bet on the citizens over time, but right now, this is one of the reasons, again, the president is drawing attention to this trend that goes a little bit unnoticed. You see it in one country, you see it in another, and you think, oh, well, that's just Russia, or maybe that's just Zimbabwe. But when you see the pattern across the globe, that's, you sound the alarm, and you see if you can get other like-minded governments and like-minded citizens and NGOs and foundations and others to team up in really contesting this very worrying trend. And if we do that, then again, it's not a close call. Governments, anachronistic governments who are trying to crack down on basic dignity versus like the power of the people, I mean, history shows who's going to win that one.
Fantastic. So we're out of time, but you follow @Ambassador Power. Is
so
that
it seems.
I'm guessing that's what it is.
So it seems.
All righty.
Yes.
If you want to follow up and continue the conversation online. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you, Ambassador Power, for being here as part of a conversation on a week when there's a lot on your mind and a lot on your agenda and a lot on the agenda of the world. As we welcome the next conversation, a quick reminder that people are listening to you and they're listening to the questions that you have, and we're making your questions part of the dialogue and the briefing, not only for our keynote listeners and our speakers, but for the dozens of meetups that are happening right now and the over 100 meetups that will happen over the course of the next few days.